Every time I read this passage about a guy ripping down barns and building bigger ones, I'm like, what a fool. And then I realized I moved here 12 years ago, and most of the buildings along the river on the east side of Midtown Manhattan were all torn down to build bigger ones. And I'm like, I guess this is a thing. So let me tell you a little story about Maya. When Maya first moved to New York City, she wanted a simple life. And so she found this little tiny studio in Astoria, Queens. Anybody from Queens in the room? Hey, got a few of them. Barely enough space for a futon, a thrifted coffee table, and one good window that framed the skyline of East Manhattan. And it wasn't fancy, but it was Maya's, it was hers. And it felt light and good and new. And then the month of June came, and it was a hot one. It was the kind of heat in New York City that sticks to your skin, where you just don't want to go down into the subway stations. And so Maya buys herself a cheap fan for the apartment, but it was loud. And so she upgraded over the months to a quieter one, but then came August, and the fan just wasn't enough anymore. And so she graduated from that newer fan that was a little bit quieter to an AC unit in her window. And as you would imagine, for Maya, her electric bill spiked a bit. And so she decided she's going to take on a few extra hours of her freelance work. But more work then meant more hours, and more hours meant some exhaustion, and some exhaustion meant some more caffeine needed. And so she ended up buying a better coffee maker for herself in her apartment, but it didn't fit on this little galley counter she had in her kitchen. And suddenly, the simple little studio apartment all of a sudden felt a little too small for her. And so she ends up moving into a one-bedroom in Long Island City. It's newer, it's brighter, twice the rent. But with it came a couch for guests. She could have family in town now, and shelves for the plants that she swore she would keep alive, and a dog for companionship. But the higher the rent was, it meant now a bigger job. It meant that she would need more money. And more money meant a tougher, more grueling job. The job brought deadlines and coworkers and the constant hum of anxiety that never quite shuts off. And to manage it, like all of us, we want to take care of ourselves, right? Especially when the stress hits. To manage it, she got a gym membership and then a therapist. Those are good. We are pro-therapy in this community here. And then just because, she was tired, she started getting some regular weekly or every other week massages, and then meal delivery because she no longer had time to cook. It was a grueling work pace. And each little thing that she added to her life, it helped, but each little thing cost a little bit more. More money, more time, more mental space. And 3 years later, after she moved into that little studio apartment in Astoria, Maya stood in a sleek corner office overlooking the skyline that she once admired from that tiny studio window. And a coworker that had been working with her for years and admired her progression up that corporate ladder, she just walked by Maya, looking at Maya. She was looking out that window, and she said, you've really made it. How did you get here? And Maya, super tired from her exhausting week, she smiles, she wipes her eyes, rubs them a bit, and says, honestly, I was just trying to stay cool one summer. That is the American treadmill. That is the consumption spiral. That's the more machine that we all know and are often a part of. And it comes from a convergence of a few different factors. One, it comes from consumer capitalism. The U.S. economy is heavily based on consumer spending. GDP growth relies on people buying more and buying more often. That is how this whole thing kind of works. Thus, advertising obviously exists, and it's not just selling products, it's selling desire itself. Ads create the sense that you'll never be enough without that next thing. And the cycle is systemic. More consumption drives more production, which drives more jobs, which fuels more consumption. It's almost a machine designed to keep us all wanting more. But then that converges. That capitalism, that consumerism-driven capitalism, it converges with this cultural emphasis on individual success. And all of a sudden we find ourselves comparing ourselves with other online influencers or somebody down the block and what they have or don't have, what they wear or what they don't wear, what latest restaurant or happy hour they went to or which one they didn't get to. And then that converges with historical roots. The frontier mentality and the American dream ethos that normalizes expansion and accumulation, land and wealth and opportunity have all historically been seen as infinite but never fully attainable. We are in this network or a matrix of more. It's the more machine. We're in this matrix of never having enough. And so currently the average household holds 10,000 pounds of stuff. 10,000 pounds of stuff. And when I was doing this research a while back, I was like, 10,000 pounds, that's gotta be like your big suburban places in the Midwest or down south in Dallas. But then I've gone into some of your apartments and I've been like, no, that's legit. On average, an American has 50,000 items in a home. We spend currently 1.2 trillion annually on things we don't need. Currently, the dog clothing industry alone is worth $16.6 billion. And so homes are not enough to contain all of our stuff, which means self-storage units. There are currently more self-storage units in our country than Walmart's, McDonald's, Burger King, and Starbucks all combined. Now here's what I want you to picture. I want you to imagine Phoebe or Peter or Junia or Paul. Somebody from the first church shows up here today in the midst of that and all of our stuff. And we tell them we are faithful Jesus followers. They would be like, what? You're Christians? Get out of here. How does this all work? That's what we find ourselves in the midst of. And so friends, here's the problem that we face today because of this more machine. We're often told that wealth will trickle down. That if the rich get richer, eventually everyone benefits. And regardless of your political or economic worldview practices, that just factually is not what is happening in our country. Since 2015, the world's richest 1% have gained more than $33.9 trillion in new wealth. That is enough to end global poverty 22 times over. And yet today, nearly half the world still lives on less than $7 a day. And so whether or not you're a person of faith, that should disorient you a little bit, right? That should just make you pause and go, this might not be okay. We live in a city currently with more millionaires than any other city in the country. Any other city in the country, we have more millionaires, and at the same time, we have more people sleeping on the streets than anywhere else in the country. The economic disparity is real. It is heavy. And the problem isn't with wealth itself. It's what happens when accumulation replaces compassion. When our systems are designed to hoard instead of to heal. For those of us that are trying to follow Jesus in this room, there's an even larger problem that this all poses. See, our spirituality is dependent upon our dependence. This is what the scripture tells us. The scripture tells us, and especially in the book of Genesis, the book of origins, that we are most fully alive and we're most fully human when we are fully depending on the one who made us and know how we work. The sin of Genesis 3 was the need to know. That was the sin. The need to be in control, the need to be independent from the provision and knowledge and power of God. And the more machine communicates a significant value for financial independence where we don't need to count on the provision of others, including God's self. Now, lastly, before we get into this scripture here, we're meant to be a community, the church, that has no need. If you've ever read the book of Acts, one of the things that it stands out in the first church is that this diverse, socioeconomically diverse, ethnically diverse, culturally diverse group of people that started to gather on a daily basis and break bread and pray and sing and consume the teachings of Jesus was that it had no financial need. People were bringing their stuff, their goods, their funds to one another to ensure that nobody in that church community had need. That was one of the things that marked the first church, the Jesus body, as something different throughout the Roman Empire. And so the question today is, how do we fight against systems that create disparity, that perpetuate hoarding and harmful greed, and that leave significant need in communities like our own? How do we resist the more machine? Well, the first is this: we release our illusion of control. We have to release our illusion of control. Someone in the crowd looked at Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, which, by the way, the Gospel of Luke is written to one man. Anybody know who the Gospel of Luke is written to? Just yell it out if you know it. Angel in the back who's been listening, Theophilus. So that Luke writes this entirety of the letter to Theophilus, who is a wealthy man. And Luke is trying to do this with the wealthy man. He's going, wealthy man, I want to pull you into the context of Jesus' ministry, which wasn't around a bunch of wealthy people. The context for Jesus' ministry, the community of Jesus, the students of Jesus, the people that Jesus went to, were all those living at or below the poverty line. They were the ones that were sick, that needed help. And he's looking at this one wealthy guy going, come in here. You need to know that, because the American church usually caters to wealthy communities, hoping that they can pull a poor person into it once in a while. That's not it, it's backwards. So Luke, you have this guy in Luke 12, looks at Jesus and said, teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me. But he said to him, friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you? He said, take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. Then he told them this parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, what should I do, for I have no place to store my crops? Then he said, I will do this. I'll pull down my barns and build large ones. There I will store all my grains and my goods, and I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things that you've prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich towards God. Listen to that. Then he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And God says to him, you fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. This very night, just like that. Guy's life is done. In other words, what did you do? What were you thinking? Why did you think that you were in control of your life and the longevity of it? I flew out to Milwaukee 2 weekends ago, to conduct a memorial for one of our neighbors here on Roosevelt Island. His name is John Massey. Now, John, if you knew him, you know he was one of the strongest men I've ever seen. Just a big, big dude. He would shake your hand and make you feel like less of a man as he shook it. And he was super present father, was always with his son Mac out on the soccer fields near the Octagon down on the north end of the island. He was faithfully married to his wife Kim for years, led multiple nonprofits throughout the city that cared for some of our most vulnerable kids. Wonderful neighbor here on Roosevelt Island. And a few months back, he started to struggle with sleep. Went a few nights without sleeping. Within the first week, it escalated into days of a mental breakdown, and after 2 weeks was diagnosed with something called prions disease. 1 out of 1 million people contract this. In essence, he contracted what we know as mad cow disease and passed away within 2 weeks of being diagnosed. And I just, as I was at his memorial and with his wife and with his child, tragedies like John's remind people like me and you that we are not in control of our lives, that at any minute it could be done. We like to pretend we're in control, but we're not. Barbara Brown Taylor once said it this way. She said, human beings don't lose control of their lives. What we lose is the illusion that we were ever in control of our lives in the first place. Now, this man in this parable that Jesus tells has forgotten his lack of control. He had forgotten his mortality. Somewhere in his psyche, the narrative that was playing out is, I will be here for a very, very long time, if not forever. And facing our mortality isn't the end of life. It actually is the beginning of generosity. Living in light of our mortality is the first step towards living generously. Most people that don't live generously are because they have the same psyche that this man in the parable has, the narrative that I'm going to be around for a lot longer. We like to live like this with our stuff. And through this parable, Jesus is inviting us to go like this. To resist the illusion of control, to release it, to let it go and go, I don't know if I'll be here tomorrow. And because of that, I'm going to be wildly generous with who I am and what I have. Second, though, we rely on the giver of all. All right, and so if we're surrendering the illusion of control and we're letting it go, we're also relying, right, just hands up, this childlike posture on the provider of all things, the giver of all. We grow up reaching up to those that are taking care of us. This is the posture of a dependent child. We do that for food. Kids do that for affection. They do it for safety. Liam, when he was little, I'm sorry I'm telling this story, but I'm going to tell it. There was a little chihuahua at one of the places that we were staying. A family member brought a little wicked chihuahua in. It was a wicked little chihuahua. And it would run after Liam and bite his ankles. And so for an entire week, this little guy would see the chihuahua and just be like, give me somewhere. I found him in a bunk bed one day on the top bunk. I was like, what are you doing? He's like, get that chihuahua out of here. But we reach out for everything: affection, safety from little chihuahuas, right? Protection, food, care. Until the person that we're reaching up to that's supposed to be caring for us is not there, or isn't paying attention to us. And often, slowly but surely, with every encounter that feels like abandonment, or every betrayal, or every time we depend on another and they don't come through, our brains begin to create a narrative that says, you're going to have to make it on your own. This is the myth of self-sufficiency. It is the myth that this man in this parable buys into as we read the scripture. What should I do? For I have a place to store my crops. Then he said, I'll do this. I'll be self-sufficient. I'll pull down my barns and I'll build bigger ones so that if chaos and crisis comes, I got this. I figured this out myself. It is the myth of self-sufficiency. It is the false belief that a person can thrive, succeed, or find fulfillment entirely on their own. Independent of others, independent of community, independent of God. It assumes that strength comes from autonomy rather than interdependence, and that needing help signals weakness instead of humanity. This myth fuels isolation. It is a myth that fuels pride. It is a myth that fuels burnout, blinding us to the truth that we are designed for connection, that we're designed for mutual dependence and divine reliance. And some of you are like, but isn't independence one of the things that we should want in life? Isn't this what we raise our children to become, fully independent? And the answer is no. No. You're told that's what you're supposed to aim for, but no. Why? Because of point one. Because at any moment, crisis could come. Because at any moment, one bad circumstance has us living on the street. Because at any moment, we can be diagnosed with a mental health crisis that we can't figure out alone. Or SNAP benefits dry up. You name it. We were made to be dependent both on God and other people. This is how we were meant to be, and instead, most of us are like, nah, I got this. Right? This is the posture most of us run with. This is the posture we're told we're supposed to have. No, I got this on my own. I will build bigger barns so if that crisis comes, I can take care of myself. And as the myth of self-sufficiency hijacks our life, we start to forget that one of God's names is provider. We see it first in Genesis 22 when God provides a ram so Abraham doesn't kill his son. Thank God for that. We see it in Exodus 16 when God gives bread from heaven to sustain his people. He provides. We see it in 1 Kings 17 when God multiplies this widow's flour and oil so she and her son don't run out. He is provider. Then he comes into the world to show us what God is exactly like in Jesus, and he feeds 5,000 people, multiplying loaves and fish to make sure he is known as provider. And then Peter is released from prison in Acts 12 as God provides an angel to free Peter and unlock the chains and the door. I mean, over and over and over again throughout the scripture, we see that God is provider, which is why every single week we do what we do, we give. We receive tithes and offerings, not simply because our operational budget needs it, which it does, not simply because we want to actually take care of the people that are on paid staff at our church, because we should. We don't want to be proud of paying people poor rates, right? But we give because putting money in that pouch or online is the embodied act of our faith, where we're going, he is provider, I am not. I reject the myth of self-sufficiency. I bank on him and him alone. Sometimes I feel like the offering should be the pinnacle of the service. We release our illusion for control. We rely on the giver of all. And lastly, is we just rejoice in giving it away. We celebrate giving away. This parable ends with a man going, and I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. Years ago, I was with a man who was 2 weeks away from retiring. He had worked at the same organization for 40 plus years, had just climbed the ladder of management, and was 2 weeks away from retiring. And I sat with him, I said, hey, so have you given much thought about what you're gonna do, once this is all done? And he's like, nah. I was like, no? He's like, nah, I'll figure it out. And I was like, have you talked to a therapist or a coach or anything? Like, you've been working nonstop for 40 plus years in the same role, and you haven't given this any thought. He's like, nah, it'll be all right. And I'm like, no, it's not gonna be all right. This is not gonna be all right. This has been a big part of who you are, and now it's not there. And 2 weeks later, he had full-on mental break. It's okay now, but he unraveled, fully unraveled. And any coach, any consultant, any therapist would have tell you that would likely be the scenario. Science says that those who volunteer, mentor, or serve in their communities often experience higher life satisfaction and better physical health and longer lifespans. Research from the University of Michigan found that retirees who regularly volunteer live longer and report higher well-being than those who do not. My friend Rich Viola says the path to life is through open hands. When we give, we discover we are alive in ways we never imagined. One of my mentors from afar, who I read nonstop, Henri Nouwen, said, life is never found in possessing but in giving. To give is to receive, to be transformed by love. Philip Yancey, another author, says generosity is the heart's way of growing. When we give, we live more deeply in God's image. Jesus would go on to say it this way: those who try to secure their lives will lose them. Those who lose their lives for my sake will find them. Very truly, I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. The guts of the good news of the gospel, which actually begins in Genesis, is that God is a giving God. That God actually delights in giving us names, that God actually delights in giving us ownership, that God actually delights in giving and giving and giving. He loves to be generous with his love, with his resources, with the empowerment of people. We then see it with Jesus as Jesus gives his life away instead of preserving it for himself. And it all culminates in the book of Acts as the Father gives the Spirit away generously to his people of all these different nations. And so if God finds delight and purpose and meaning and joy in giving stuff away, why would we, his creation, who he has intricately made, think that we find life anywhere else? We are designed to celebrate and find joy and rejoice in being generous. We are most alive and delighted and celebrated when we're giving away. And so the three beliefs that help us resist the more monster: 1, resist the illusion of control. 2, rely on the giver of all. 3, rejoice in giving away. Now, let me end here. how can we embody these beliefs? Because it's easy to say we believe all that stuff, and then y'all still don't give nothing, right? Like, it's very easy to do that. We just need to be honest. How do we embody these beliefs? And I'm going to give you a very practical definition that comes from another pastor. I thought it was as clunky as it could be, this definition of generosity, but man, it was a really good definition. Here it is. Generosity is the premeditated, calculated, designated emancipation of financial assets. That's what he says generosity. I heard that, I was like, man, that does not roll off the tongue easily. But then I started thinking about it. I was like, I love this definition. It is premeditated, calculated, designated emancipation of financial assets. In order to live generously, he's saying you have to have a plan, a premeditated plan. Otherwise, your generosity is spontaneous, right? Random acts of generosity. You wait for somebody to ask, and if you have something, you give it to them, which that's not bad. It's actually the majority of the way people around the country give is giving spontaneously. But giving spontaneously doesn't make you generous. I want you to hear this. Giving spontaneously doesn't make you generous. Giving spontaneously makes you spontaneous. Right? Generosity is a whole different deal. And when we give spontaneously, we end up making unwise decisions like this man in this parable, who goes, you know what, crisis is coming, I'm gonna build a bigger barn. Dumb idea. But he had that dumb idea because there was not a premeditated plan for his generosity when abundance came. So we need that premeditated plan. Otherwise, we build bigger barns, we waste it on Uber Eats, we buy another set of sneakers we didn't need. Why? Because it was not a premeditated decision. And author Ronald Blue says this: there's basically only 5 things you can use your money on. Or 5 things you can do with your money. 1, you can spend it, right? 2, you can pay down your debt. 3, you can pay your taxes. 4, you can save it. 5, you can give it away to others. Now I want you, that's actually the sequence that most people live out with their, right? Usually that's the sequence that people live, but I want you to hear this. Spending it is you first, right? Paying down debt, that's actually because you spent money you didn't have, and so it's still focused on you first. Then you got the government, and then you have save it, which is you first. And then last is you give it to others, which is others focused. And so I don't know how to say this any differently. You can call yourself a Christian. I can call myself a Christian. I can know all the doctrine in the world. I can debate you about why Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and give you all the answers that you've been looking for. But if the sequence of my generosity is me focus, government, me focus, other people, I have completely missed the boat on the gospel of Jesus Christ. And in reality, I might believe something cognitively, but I'm not believing Jesus at all. And the reason that the first church was so electric is because it just flipped that thing on its head. And yet the majority of us in the room call ourselves really good Christians. We use our money in the same sequence that the rest of the world does. And we have to have a calculated, premeditated plan. It allows us to reorder our priorities so that we truly embody the way of Jesus. I know I'm running over. I'm going to go 2 more minutes here. And calculated. Generous people pre-decide. I want you to hear this. And I know some of you, listen, some of you in here are like, oh, man, we're just talking money, huh? Yes. We are talking money. And I need you to hear this. God doesn't need your money. God doesn't need your money. But we live in New York City where money is central and at the forefront of our minds. And if we can't actually carry it with a biblical view in the way of Jesus, we're in trouble. This has got to be one of the primary mechanisms of our discipleship. If we don't get generosity right in the city of New York, we don't have Jesus right in the city of New York. Generous people pre-decide. They don't wait to be asked. They have pre-decided amount or a percentage. Norman's going to talk about that a little bit next week. And that's percentage, just so you know, percentage is way better because that rises or falls with income. And that money is just waiting for an opportunity. It's just waiting for an opportunity, right? And you know this, life is crazy, man. Kids, relationships, work, friendships, dating, networking. There is a lot rolling through our minds and hearts, which is why Jesus said, I need you to seek first the kingdom of God. And in New York City, where finances are such a big deal for so many of us, this is what it means. It means to prioritize a percentage of your money and giving it away first. And that will become, I'll tell you, if you've ever read any of the habit books, that will become a keystone habit for all of your money. If you prioritize giving first, a percentage of your money away, everything else about how you handle finances will flow from that. It is a keystone habit that Jesus followers are called to get right. And then we designate it. Generous people have already decided ahead of time where they're allocating their giving. They don't have to be asked. They don't need to be pitched. They have already started dreaming about where that generosity is going to be designated. And it doesn't mean you don't go above and beyond and sporadically give when somebody asks on the street or somebody's in need down the block, but that's above and beyond. And we give from both a grateful heart and a broken heart. We give to the things that we're grateful for. And so if you're for my family, we are insanely grateful that we have a local church here on Roosevelt Island that we can celebrate with and grieve with and lament with and party with. We're grateful for. This has been extended family for us. And so a massive chunk of our giving goes to this church. And we are incredibly grateful for ministries that have walked alongside our migrant neighbors that have been totally disoriented over the last few years of life in the United States. And so we give a chunk of our giving to Immigration Connect, a ministry that's doing good work with immigrants around the city and around the region. But we look for the things that we're grateful for and the things that break our heart. And so I'm so saddened when I see the next generation miss out on the grace of God. Right? And so part of my giving, what breaks my heart is young people that don't know who they are and their value. And so part of my giving goes to Young Life, a ministry that's doing incredible good work with young people in our city. Premeditated, calculated, designated emancipation of our financial resources. Now, let me end here. And I know I blew past the 2 minutes that I said. If I ever give you a time that I'm going to end, just know it's wrong. It's not the intent, it's just reality. Last story, and then we'll celebrate communion together. Years ago, I was walking in the city and saw a man slunched over on the corner. And that's not an odd sight for us in New York, right? Like that's a normal thing we see. But then as I was walking with my son, we started to hear the man start to make his plea for money. Again, something normal. We hear it all the time. We hear people asking for money all the time. What was different is that this time, I knew that person, and my son knew that person, and my son looked at me and goes, is that who I think that is? I said, yes. And we reverted our eyes because we didn't want this person to feel any shame as they saw us, because that person knew us as well. And that person at that point in time was a part of this church. And I remember walking away from that encounter with that person thinking, dang it. When I started in ministry and when I started to cultivate new church communities, I did so because I wanted to start a church that looked like the book of Acts. And part of that meant that that church community would have no need among them. And now I was looking at one of our people who was a member of our church that was on the corner of the street in New York City asking for money. And I had realized I didn't create and cultivate the community that I set out to create. Our witness to the world that the Spirit of God is still alive and still moving and still mending hearts will be our generosity. And in the economic disparity, being a socioeconomically diverse church community, it will be when people from the outside looking in see that this diverse community has no need among them. That only happens, though, if we're able to actually embody these three beliefs. And so I'm begging you today, church. I'm begging you to live out the vision and way of Jesus in our time, and to be marked by a premeditated, by a calculated, by a designated emancipation of your financial resources. Not because I need it, not because God needs it, but because we have people in our midst that need it, and because you and your maturity, your spiritual maturity rests on your generosity. You cannot pull those two things apart.